No, so I wanted to talk about the hope tonight. And, the quote that I've known about a long time from William Shakespeare. Um, let's see, there it goes. Get that thing off my screen. A quote that I've known about for a long time: the miserable have no, the miserable have no other medicine but only hope. And that's really true for so many of the people in the world. They don't have a way to climb out of the hole they're in. They may be sick, they may be disadvantaged in some way, oppressed in some way. And so hope is the medicine for them. Hope is what they cling to. And you and I need to know that, be aware of that, and need to teach into that. In other words, we don't have to all become experts in every aspect of the hope, but you should be able to articulate the basics of the hope to people so that they can get it. Like Philippians, where it says we're going to get new bodies. Corinthians 15, where it says that the corruptible has become incorruptible, the mortal has become immortal. And the concept, like I have found when presenting the hope, that if I can get people on the same page with me very quickly and very simply, it really helps. And so where I typically go is I'll say, have you heard of the Battle of Armageddon? And everybody has. At least I've never met anyone that hasn't heard of the Battle of Armageddon. So when I say, have you heard of the Battle of Armageddon? And they say yes, immediately they're involved in there. They get this kind of light at the end of the tunnel, like, wow, I know something here. And then I move to, well, what do you know about the Battle of Armageddon? And then the darkness comes in, because then they say, well, I really don't know much about the Battle of Armageddon. And then I say, well, let me tell you a little bit about it. You've heard of it as the final battle. They'll say yes, and I don't. Even though that's not true, I don't argue with them at that point, or try to explain. You want to keep things simple. And I say, well, in Armageddon, Christ, who's in heaven, comes down and conquers the earth, and it's all this huge giant battle, and that's why it's called Armageddon. And they're, oh, okay, I get that. And I say, well, what's really interesting about the Battle of Armageddon? No, what? Christ never gets on his horse and goes back up. He stays on earth. And people are like, oh, that's interesting. And then it becomes easy to begin to talk to them about how what is coming in the hope is a beautiful restored sunset. I mean, restored earth. You can say, do you like sunsets? Oh yeah, I love sunsets. By the way, I've been doing this a long time. I've never had anyone tell me I hate sunsets. Never. Not a single person. So you say, do you love sunsets? Yes. Do you love campfires? Yes. God hardwired that into us. He hardwired us loving, beautiful nature scenes and things like that. And so that's one of the things that's going to be so wonderful about the future earth, which is why Christ called it paradise. Remember the thief on the cross, you shall be with me in paradise. And you just try to keep the picture simple. My wife listens over my shoulder and she kind of kicks me if she thinks I'm overwhelming them, which is easy for me to do because I get excited about it. But she's really good about kind of keeping an eye on things. She's much better at reading people than I am. So here's Christ. And we go to Matthew chapter 4, and I'm not going to read from Matthew 4, but if you look at the end of Matthew chapter 4, what's Christ doing? He's walking around, especially northern Israel, to Galilee, and he's healing all kinds of people. And of course, back then, I mean, gosh, we don't like being sick now. And back then, they didn't even have painkillers. So everybody wanted to be healed, and rightfully so. And so the next thing you know, Christ has this huge multitude that's following him. So then we go to Matthew chapter 5. And in Matthew chapter 5, we have the Sermon on the Mount. And what I think we need to understand and follow Christ's model is, here's Christ, here's this huge multitude, here's his first major sermon. Okay, get out a piece of paper and kind of write down, what would you open with? what's the coolest? You could say, God is love. Yes, God, there's so many different things. Or I'm the Messiah, believe in me. You just think of all the things that Christ could have opened this first major sermon with, and he opens on the hope. And I think that is a model for us about how important the hope really is. And so verse 1 says, and seeing the multitudes, he went up on the mountain. And when he had sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying. And so he went up to a mountain. Went to a place where he was sure a whole bunch of people could hear him. And that's important. He wanted to be heard by as many people as possible. And he starts out, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so he starts talking about the hope and the kingdom of heaven. Let's talk a second about the word blessed. Every once in a while, I can't remember if the Revised Standard Version or it's a word that in the Greek meant more happy than blessed. And why is that? Well, it's because the Greeks, just like today, I only have English really that I can comfortably express myself in. And so English has a pretty limited vocabulary. Bill Schlegel and I had quite a conversation yesterday because we were dealing with a Hebrew word that has no English equivalent. And that's the world's most frustrating thing, because you're trying to translate, and here's this word in Hebrew, and you know exactly what it is, and there's simply nothing in English that expresses it. And so you just can't write a paragraph in the Bible every time it occurs. So you have to kind of pick a word that kind of gets in the ballpark. Well, what's the situation? In the Greek world, if a god did something great for you, you were happy about it. And so the word makairos, it kind of means happy. Here's the problem. When you bring that into a Christian perspective, so many times what God does for us, we're blessed in the sense that internally we know what's going on. We're joyful about it. We know we're blessed by God, but it isn't a particularly happy circumstance. So, for example, in verse 11, blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you. Now, we wouldn't want to sub in the word happy there. But we have to understand that the reason that the word is used in the Greek is um, not because blessed doesn't really work, but it's because they didn't have a really good word to express this concept as you came from the Greek culture into the Christian culture. And so therefore, blessed is a good translation if we properly understand it. That we're blessed by God in the sense that we should have an understanding of what's going on. We should have an internal joy about it. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're particularly happy with the circumstances. But if you're getting my meaning here, you're blessed, you're joyful, there's an inner light, an inner radiance from the understanding, not from the circumstance, but from the understanding that you're getting, because you know that this is going to yield an everlasting weight in glory type of thing. So here he starts out and he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The people did not yet fully understand what the kingdom of heaven was. They learned more about it in Christ's teaching and as his teaching ministry continued, but they knew enough to know that the Old Testament portrayed that the Messiah would come to earth, conquer the earth, and he would set things right. And they understood that to be the kingdom of heaven. And a number of people in his audience would have understood that. Many wouldn't have, because of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but many would have understood that the Messiah was supposed to come. That's why when John the Baptist said the coming of the Messiah is near, so many people went out to be baptized. They wanted to get into this kingdom on earth. And so Christ says, blessed are the poor in spirit. And this is a double use of idiomatic vocabulary. The first is the word poor, which was used idiomatically for being humble. And we can see that in verses. In a second, we'll go to a verse in Isaiah and see the exact same thing. So that if we understand the word poor as humble, common idiom in the culture, and then spirit, and spirit was used of it was used of Holy Spirit. It was used of your attitude, like we today talk about having, let's say, a good school spirit, that type of thing. It was used of your thoughts, your emotions, your attitude. So here's Christ, and he's opening up and he says, look, you are blessed by God if you are humble in your attitude, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. You're going to be in the kingdom of the Messiah on earth. And why would he say that? Because if you're humble in your attitude, then you obey God. And remember, the rich young ruler came to Christ and said, what must I do to inherit everlasting life? And Christ said, you know the commandments, keep the commandments. It's like, oh, well, what does it take to keep the commandments? It takes a humble attitude. You're not like, well, I know God says to rest on the Sabbath, but I don't feel like it. You had to have a humble attitude to keep the commandments. And so he says, blessed are those who have a humble attitude, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And I'm amazed. I guess I'm really amazed at the kind of the arrogance of American culture, that so many people are so invested in I have a voice and I need to speak, and the people that are getting plastic surgery so their selfies look better. Not that there's anything wrong with that in and of itself, but what's the attitude behind it? There is a me, kind of an I'm important attitude that then lends itself to, I'll pick and choose if I want to obey God. And so if God says not to use foul language, obscenity, which he does in Ephesians 5:3, well, I'm sorry, I'm emotional right now, I'm expressing myself. Okay, since when did your attitude become more important than God's command? We get the same thing when it comes to sexual morals or modesty or all kinds of different things. That how is our attitude toward God? Is it really humble? Back here, when they didn't have salvation by the new birth, it was really important. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And let's go to Isaiah chapter 66, verse 2. Because one of the points that I'll be making over and over again through this is that what Christ is saying here in the Sermon on the Mount, it's succinct, it's put together well, but it wasn't original. There's not one single thing in what Christ said in these Beatitudes that's original. Every point that he made is an elucidation or a repetition of something that God had stated, sometimes many different ways in the Old Testament. So for example, when we read Isaiah 66 verse 2, let's pick up verse 1, get some context. This is what Yahweh says: heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build me? And what place could be my rest? Verse 2, for all these things my hand has made, and so all these things came to be, says Yahweh. So he's saying, look, stuff I got. I got the heaven, I got the earth. The thing that's really different is you people, because I've given you free will. So quit being so recalcitrant. It's basically what he's saying. He says, but this is the person I will look upon with favor, even to him who is a humble and contrite spirit. Now, if you're reading the King James Version, who is of a poor and contrite spirit, because just like in the Greek, where poor was used idiomatically of humble, in the Hebrew in the Old Testament, the word poor was used idiomatically of humble. And so if you go and say check 10 or 15 versions of the Bible, you'll find more literal versions like the King James that will actually say poor here, and in other versions that understand the idiomatic use and want to bring it into something that your modern reader can understand a little better, than like the REB, you'll say humble. So God says, this is the person I'm going to look at with favor, the person who has a humble and contrite spirit and who trembles at my word, meaning you look at the word and you go, hey, I better tighten up my ship here. I better work a little harder to be obedient. And God, who's given people free will, he's got control of the physical stuff. He wants people to respond to him. And he says, here are the people I'm going to look upon with favor. Of course, they want to be humble, contrite spirit. They tremble at my word, meaning they're obedient. And what does it mean when he says he looks upon them with favor? It means they're going to be saved. They're going to get into the kingdom. And so that's exactly what Christ says, again, in a tighter fashion, if you will. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And that's where Christ was going with his opening salvo. He's got this big, huge multitude. Hey, people, be humble if you want to live forever in my kingdom. Beautiful opening statement. Then he says, follows up verse 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. That would be amazingly powerful to Christ's audience, because there wasn't a really an effective middle class in the biblical world of Jesus Christ. You had the very rich, hoity-toity people, and basically everybody else lived hand to mouth. And the poor people, as you see, the prophets were constantly harping about this, that they were downtrodden. The rich people took advantage of them, stole their land, did all kinds of terrible things. At the time of Christ, the Romans beat up on them, the tax collectors beat up on them, the wealthy people beat up on them. They were just, life was a struggle. They didn't have the healing medicines that we do today. So there was a lot of death at the time of Christ. The average lifespan for a woman, we're told by historians, people who they dig up tens of thousands of graves all over the Roman Empire. They look at teeth, they look at bones, they get average ages. From what we can tell from the archaeological discoveries and what we can tell from the epigraphical discoveries, like when we look at gravestones and it says this person died at 30, this person died at 25. There was a gravestone found recently where a young woman had died at 25. And so what do the historians conclude? The historians conclude that your average lifespan of a woman at the time of Christ was in the early 30s, say 32. You think today, boy, if a woman dies at 32, that's really sad. And the men made it a little longer, late 30s, maybe 38, 39. So people didn't live very long. So that's one of the reasons, by the way, that in the culture, people married young and had children young, because you figure if you get married, if a man gets married at 16 and then, basically he's going to, any child that he has, even if his wife gets pregnant that year, he's going to have about 20 years with that child and then he's gone. Today that would be a tragedy for us, but that's what's going on in the culture. Well, what did that mean? There was a load of mourning in that culture. There were deaths to the right and deaths to the left, and death was very unpredictable. And so there were a lot of people mourning. And so it was very important for Christ to come forward and say, look, audience, I know that this life is tough. I know many of you are mourning, but let me promise you, you will be comforted. Is that brand new? Is that some kind of new thing that people, were surprised at? No, go to Isaiah chapter 61. Here comes Jesus Christ in prophecy, Isaiah 61. It says, and Jesus, by the way, quoted this actually in Luke chapter 4. He says, the Spirit of the Lord Yahweh is upon me, because Yahweh has anointed me to preach the good news to the humble. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, and to provide for those who mourn in Zion by giving them a garland for ashes. In other words, you get a crown on your head instead of ashes, because, when you're mourning, you put ashes on yourself. So instead of ashes on you, you get a garland. You get the oil of joy instead of your mourning, a garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, so that they may be called trees of righteousness, the planting of Yahweh, so that he may be glorified. So here's one of the Old Testament prophecies that say, yes, you may mourn now. Yes, there's problems with this earth. Yes, life is tough now, but the Lord is coming. And when he comes, it's not going to be ashes anymore. It's going to be crowns of praise. It's going to be, garments of praise for people. And so so what does Christ do with this? He he just tightens it up and summarizes it very quickly. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And when do they get comforted? They get comforted at the resurrection. They get comforted in the next life. One of the things that's, when you have wrong doctrine, two things are really hurtful about that. One is that you're wrong, not right. And it's hard to be wrong when there's right doctrine available. You'll never get the truth if you're wrong. But the other downside of having wrong doctrine is not only are you wrong, but it keeps you from further searching for what is right. And so what happens in the church, what has happened to the church historically, and you can check this on the commentaries, and I read several of them today about this, and they're trying to make this work for now, because they believe that the Beatitudes are about this life. And why do they believe that? Because they don't know about the Millennial Kingdom. They believe that once you die, your spirit goes to heaven, lives in heaven forever. And because of that, they can't relate that to the earth. So therefore, these things, like the next one, the meek will inherit the earth, that somehow or other they got to make them work about this life. And so if you take a verse like 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, and they're trying to conjure up some way that people who mourn now will be comforted. Well, there's a lot of people who mourn and go down to their grave mourning. But the reason that we're going to be comforted is because there's going to be a resurrection and things are going to be completely joyful, and we'll get the land again. So this is about the future, not about the now. So then the next thing he says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Now, if you notice so far, the kingdom of heaven, where is it? It's on earth. Blessed are those who mourn. They will be comforted. When they get raised from the dead and they're in their new bodies on a new earth. Same thing. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Loads and loads of verses, by the way, about people inheriting the earth, because God created us to be earth people. That's why he put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. We're supposed to live on the earth. And so there's a lot of verses. Now, this is the only verse in the Beatitudes that's actually quoted from the Old Testament itself. The others are references. But if you go back to 37:11, Psalm 37:11, please. If you look at verse 10, yet a little while and the wicked will be no more. Yes, though you look all over for his place, yet he will not be. But the humble, and that would be again the same as meek, will inherit the land, the earth, if you will, and delight themselves in the abundance of peace. So the meek will inherit the earth, literally is coming right out of Psalm 37:11, and there's a whole bunch in here about that. And if you look at the commentary on this particular verse in Matthew, there's a lot of references. But I would like to go to Matthew chapter 24, starting in verse 37, because I think if we go to Matthew 24, I want to explain this and make sure that we're all on the same page, because the Christian world really, along with not understanding on the Sermon on the Mount, they miss the meaning here in Matthew chapter 24, and we want to pay attention to it. Now, Matthew 24 is Jesus Christ talking about his return and what's going to happen when he returns. And when he returns, the good people in the sheep and goat judgment are going to be left on earth, and the evil people are going to be taken by the angels and thrown into the lake of fire. And that's the background here to Matthew 25. He's going to explain, 24. He's going to explain that in more detail in the next chapter, in Matthew chapter 25. But as we read through verse 37, he says, and by the way, at this time, he's on the Mount of Olives and he's talking to his disciples about the end times. So verse 37, he says, for as in the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Now, this is not the rapture. Jesus didn't know about the rapture. This is before his resurrection, the death and resurrection. The disciples certainly knew nothing of the rapture. The coming of the Son of Man was the coming of Jesus Christ. The apostles at this time hadn't even put together that Christ was going to die. So when they're listening to this and they're hearing about the parousia, the coming, the personal presence of the Son of Man, what many of them are thinking is, okay, Jesus is about to go wandering off in the wilderness, and then he's going to come back with a whole army of angels, and he's going to kick tail and take over the earth. And that's what they were thinking. And that's why the resurrection, the death of Christ caught him off guard. The resurrection caught him off guard. Christ had to straighten him out. But that's what they were thinking, that the coming of the Son of Man would be when Christ turned from this meek, mild-mannered, Clark Kent type person, and he would become the Superman and kick the Romans' tail and take over the earth. So he says, okay, Christ, of course, knows that they don't really understand, but he's laying this down, knowing that after his resurrection, they will understand it. So he says that is the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man, verse 38. For as they were in those days that were before the flood, eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and they did not know what was coming until the flood came and took them all away. Very important. The ones being taken away are evil. The ones that are left in the ark are the good people. That's important. And the flood came and took them away. So also will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two men will be in the field. One is taken and one is left. You go to Matthew chapter 25, the one that's taken is taken by the angels and thrown into the lake of fire. And as Christ conquers the earth, the one that's left gets to be there on the earth in Christ's kingdom. And so that's very important. That's what's going on here. Verse 41, two women are grinding with a hand mill. One is taken, meaning taken to the lake of fire. One is left and will be left here on earth into the kingdom. 42, therefore watch, you don't know on what day your Lord comes. And verse 44, therefore you be ready too, because the Son of Man will come in an hour you do not expect. So back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 5, when Christ says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. That is literal. You and I will be inheriting the earth. We'll be, we will have a place on earth. Verse 6, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they will be filled. Righteousness here is the Old Testament use of righteousness, which meant that it was right living that resulted in salvation. Here, the emphasis is not so much on the salvation part, it's just people are hungering and thirsting for right living on earth, when there won't be bullying and there won't be lawlessness and there won't be murders and thefts and killing, when all the evil people are gone. And he says, are you hungering and thirsting for a time when there's going to be justice and peace and right living on earth? If you are, you will be filled. And there's a lot about this. Let's a whole lot about this, because that was a whole big part of the hope, was that in the future, when Christ ruled the earth, it would be a place of righteousness and peace and joy. And so Isaiah chapter 1, let's just go to Isaiah chapter 1. And again, there's a lot of these verses, so we can't take time to cover many of them, but and a lot of them are in the commentary. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 26, talking about what's coming in the future. Isaiah 1:26, God says, I will restore your judges as at the first, and your counselors as at the beginning. After that, you will be called the city of righteousness, faithful town. Zion will be redeemed with justice, and those in her who repent by righteousness. Verse 28, but both rebels and sinners will be broken, and those who forsake Yahweh will come to an end. Praise God. And I think about this earth, and frankly, as fallen as this earth is, if the only thing that changed on earth was that all the evil people disappeared, we could make a good living here. We could make this a great place. It's astounding how much hurt and pain is caused by evil people. And there just won't be any around in the next life. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 11, verse 4. Here's a verse, Isaiah 11, that when we're talking about Jesus Christ and the kind of man he is, we have to be careful that we represent both sides of Jesus, because I've heard people say, well, Jesus would never kill anybody. His mission on earth the first time was to die for the sins of mankind. But will Jesus Christ kill the enemies of God? Absolutely, he will. It wasn't his mission when he first came. It will definitely be part of his mission when he comes back. You read Isaiah chapter 63. He's got blood on his skirts. Here in Isaiah chapter 11, it says in verse 4, but with righteousness he will judge the poor. Remember, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, and decide with equity for the humble of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the spirit from his lips, he will kill the wicked. So why is there going to be righteousness? Because the wicked people will be gone. Let's go to Matthew 5:7. Matthew 5:7, blessed are the merciful, for they will obtain mercy. Again, an Old Testament concept. This is not new. And what we see here is Jesus Christ doing what you and I are need to be doing on earth, because the people at the time of Christ had lost their hope. They lost their vision. The Sadducees didn't even believe in a resurrection. The Pharisees believed in an eternal soul like the Greeks did. So there were people that were walking around who had the idea. John the Baptist certainly did, and some others, but it's kind of like the truth today. The majority of the people didn't have truth, and just a few people did. And so Christ is speaking into the situation. And that's what we need to do today. And he was using things from the Old Testament. So if we look at Hosea 6:6, for example. And in Hosea 6:6, let me get there. What does the Bible say? For I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. And so Christ was talking about mercy and what he wanted. And of course, when he's talking about the people who are going to get into his kingdom in Matthew chapter 25, well, let's just go there. Let's go to Matthew chapter 25. Because here he's talking about the sheep and goat judgments. And the sheep and goat judgment is when he comes to earth, conquers the earth, and makes the decision of who gets into his kingdom and who doesn't. And he says in verse 34, then the king will say to the people on his right, those who are blessed, Come, you've been blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom that's been prepared for you. Why? Verse 35, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. It doesn't say I was hungry and you had extra food and so you gave me something to eat. It says I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. A lot of these people didn't have a lot to give, but they understood what hunger was. And so they shared what they had. I was hungry, you gave me something. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. Naked and you clothed me. Sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. And it's these people that Christ says, you are getting into my kingdom. See, just like he said in verse 7, blessed are the merciful, for they will obtain mercy. How are they going to obtain mercy? The real mercy is that you're given everlasting life. Verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Let's go to Psalm 34. And in Psalm 34, and we'll start in verse 3. Let's see, is that right? Did I get this right? 24. Duh, that'll help. I'm in the wrong psalm. I was going to say, that doesn't look right. Psalm 24, my apologies. Now let's go to verse 3. Okay, there we go. So, who may ascend to the mountain of Yahweh? Who may stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not lifted up his soul to what is false and has not sworn deceitfully, he will receive a blessing from Yahweh, even righteousness from the God of his salvation. Remember, righteousness, they didn't use the word saved in the Old Testament to refer to everlasting life. They used the word righteousness. So this person who has clean hands and a pure heart and hasn't sworn deceitfully, he receives a blessing from the Lord, everlasting life. So what did Christ say? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. In the Millennial Kingdom, they will see God in the person of Jesus Christ, like the apostles did in the everlasting kingdom, according to Revelation chapter 21. They will see God face to face, and he will be with us. Verse 9 of Matthew chapter 20 of Matthew 5. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. And we have to be careful that we don't read backwards into this, the new birth, because when it says they will be the sons of God, it's not, you've got to think of the Old Testament. What were they talking about at that time period? And it would mean that the peacemakers would be the sons of God, like when we talk about the sons of the prophets, that kind of thing. It's the ones who form themselves to be like God, the disciples of God, if you will, the followers of God. Blessed are the peacemakers. When people see them and understand them, they say, those people are genuine followers of God. Of course, that's going to lead to everlasting life. Let's go to Psalm 37 again. I've been there before. Let's go again to Psalm 37. Very powerful psalm, Psalm 37 is. And Psalm 37, verse 37. Watch a blameless person and see the upright, for there is a future for a person of peace. There's a what a beautiful expression. I mean, the understatement here is just so powerful. Instead of, God could have just said, the person of peace is going to live forever. Instead, it's this kind of beautiful understatement that invites us into the conversation. There's a future for a person of peace. Amen. That's exactly right. No wonder Romans 12 says, as much as is in us, and available to us, live peaceably with all people. There's a future for a person of peace. So again, when Christ says, blessed are the peacemakers, they will be called the disciples of God, the followers of God. They're the ones invited into everlasting life. It's not something that Christ just invented. He's pulling this out of the Old Testament. And then verse 10, and now we have kind of a read a couple verses together. Blessed are those who've been persecuted because of their righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you, verse 11, when people insult you. Now, again, see, this is one of the reasons that the translation happy really doesn't work. It's not about, there are times when this stuff can involve happiness, but it's more the idea, the Christian idea of blessedness. Blessed are those who have been persecuted. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil things against you falsely because of me. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad. Why? Because we've got to have an understanding, we've got to have a scope that pulls in how valuable salvation is and how valuable rewards in the kingdom is. Because, why should we rejoice and be exceedingly glad when we're being insulted and reviled, but we're standing up for God, and we're trying to help people understand the truth, and we're trying to be examples like Christ. And he says what? He says, great is your reward in heaven. And then we should just go, oh yeah, that's great. That's wonderful. Because compared to what they can do on earth, man, the reward in heaven is so huge. And he says, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And so we want to, again, so many verses that could be brought up about this, about prophets who stood. And of course, Hebrews chapter 11 goes into the heroes of the faith, and some of them were tortured, and all these horrible things happened to them. And many of them, many of them were martyred for their faith. We believe that Isaiah was, we believe Jeremiah was, others of the prophets specifically stated that they were martyred for the faith and just stood until death. And so what does Christ say? You're blessed if you've been persecuted because of your righteousness, your right living, your stand for God. Blessed if people insult and persecute you because of Christ, and great is our reward in heaven. So the model here is that Jesus Christ he's healing, he gets this huge crowd together. What is he going to share? And he opens up with this salvo about how you need to be if you're going to live forever, and the value of living forever and having everlasting life, and the beauty of the everlasting kingdom. And we can do the same thing for people around us. Back to the Shakespeare quote, the miserable have no other medicine but only hope. So many people in the world today are they're depressed, they're on antidepressants, they're miserable, they don't have a vision, some of them don't seem to have a reason for living, and we can bring the hope to them. And that's a wonderful, godly thing to do. We certainly see it modeled in Jesus Christ. So thank you for being with me. This has been really wonderful. It was, once again, just a tremendous day for me to go through this again and see these things with such clarity. And I hope this has been a blessing to you too.